Okay, now we are going to open it up for a panel discussion. And in the meantime, if our audience members also have any questions for our panelists, you can use the Q&A function, which is the icon at the bottom with the two speech bubbles. Our first question for our panelists is, in the context of addressing and repairing harm, the intention for this panel discussion is not to compare side by side the wartime experiences of Japanese Americans to that of 4 centuries of systemic racism against Black Americans in the form of slavery, Jim Crow, segregation, and racist housing policies. However, looking back on the 40-year effort to seek restitution of civil rights, an apology, and monetary compensation for Japanese Americans, what are the lessons to be learned from that fight? And not to put Jon on the spot, but this might be a good question for you to start with. So thank you.
Sure, I'd happy to get started. To me, the biggest takeaway is that Japanese Americans would have never achieved reparations without the support of other communities. And that was so critical to that movement having a positive outcome. And, I do always like to just mention, and you saw the footage from then Congressman Ron Dellums, but I think it's so important to acknowledge that when HR 442 was coming before Congress, the Congressional Black Caucus was unanimous in their support for it. And I always like to lift up that point because clearly members of that caucus could have easily said, what about us? What about the harm that has not been addressed for our community? But they chose to stand with us. And I think it's so important. To me, it's such an important lesson, and why I made this film, why I talk about this topic all over the country is I'm just a believer that the only way we are going to make significant progress in addressing systemic racism in this country is together. And that we really have to explore every opportunity to be able to work in solidarity, in coalition with one another to really make progress in this country.
Thank you, Jon. Pamela, did you want to add anything to that question, which is about what are the lessons to be learned from the Japanese American movement for reparations or redress?
Thank you so much, Jon. I think that I'm going to piggyback off of what you said. Several times it's been talked about the necessity for unity across race, class, culture, to support our efforts. But I think what you said with regard to Congressman Dellums and others is that they put words, they were vocal about the support. And so to me, that's the most important lesson. It's good to be supportive in our own individual communities, but it's better to be supportive with words behind it, vocally and out in the open, because it may be just enough to give other communities the courage to vocalize their support as well. So it happened because of vocalized support from many different people. So that's what I have learned. Thank you. Thank folks for support, but be courageous enough to vocalize it. That not only our community may know, but that the rest of the world may know, okay, it's time to step up and do something. So that's what I have to say.
Thank you, Pamela. Would James or Benjamin have anything to add? And we can also go on to another question as well. Hi, Benjamin.
Hello. one of the things that I have noticed since the Japanese internment is that with the unanimous support of the African American community at that time, fast forward to the 21st century, the Asian community in America is one that constitutes other cultures beyond Japanese. You know, Hmong communities, there are Vietnamese communities, Cambodian communities. And on the Black side, for lack of a better term, there are more African immigrants in America currently than there were back in the times of HR 40. And so with the increase of people from the continent of Africa, the continent of Asia, who are not Japanese or who are not interned or who are not descendants of slaves in America, is that broader community, does that dilute the intensity of the support that we saw decades ago? And if so, how do we bring those people into the fold for more bodies that can move forward in unity?
Thank you, Ben. And James, I'm going to hand it off to you, but this is a very good segue for the next question, but maybe I'll see if James, if you want to add any thoughts.
No, well, I mean, I just want to thank Jon for this piece of media, this documentary, which should be distributed as broad and widely as possible, simply because he, well, for a number of reasons, but on a personal level, I didn't notice the, or I was oblivious or ignorant to the overlap between the Japanese redress and HR 40 and the community overlap and alliances that were there back in the 60s. And for someone that thought they were aware of a lot of these coalitions, not until I was involved in this panel was it highlighted as strongly as it was. But I just want to commend Jon for having the opportunity and the ask, and for being so thorough in the work, that it's a nice digestible sort of curriculum-based piece that could simply inform others that think that they're aware of these alliances as well. And that speaks, I think, to Ben and Pam's view that more people, more bodies, more knowledge can only help move the issue forward.
Thanks, James. So yes, my next question is about coalition building and working across communities. And so we've talked a bit about the support that the redress movement had from the Congressional Black Caucus. And we see in the film the speech from Ron Dellums as an example. And so this question is about, what are some examples of coalition building in reparations for Black Americans today? And why should all communities care about this movement? So we've been talking about this already, but if there are any things to add to that question.
I'll speak with regard to the work that I do at the Minnesota Council of Churches. So I am one of the co-directors for racial justice at the Minnesota Council of Churches. We are a membership organization of 27 church denominations throughout the state of Minnesota. And most of those denominations are your regular Protestant congregations, in addition to the Greek Orthodox Church and the Mennonite Church and the 4 African-American denominations that are represented in the state of Minnesota. We are tasked with the to create programming to bring truth-telling or stories of harms from both the African-American and Native American communities to these congregations, to educate these congregations on what the harm has done to these communities, and then to come up with a charge of reparations so that the churches can participate in the reparations process or for the repair of harm that the church has been complicit with in the state of Minnesota. So we are building coalitions through denomination to do that effort. Our executive board consists of the bishops and the leaderships of these denominations who are making available to us information with regard to congregations who are interested in doing this work. So that's one way we're trying to build coalitions here in Minnesota for my particular agency.
I'll lift up a couple of examples I wanted to share. One that some joining us here today might be aware of is there's a group called the National Nikkei Reparations Coalition that was organized for the express purpose of raising awareness about HR 40, about educating communities, because this is an issue that as I am very privileged to be able to talk about in various communities around the country. It's something that this country hasn't been willing to talk about, doesn't understand. And so it requires just a lot of conversations within our own communities about what this means, and that the different levels, how layered it is, and how it is about addressing harm for slavery in this country, but it's also about the subsequent ways in which the Black community has been prevented from accumulating wealth in this country. So I think that work is so important. I do also want to lift up my colleague, attorney Don Tamaki, who is one of the attorneys who reopened Fred Korematsu's case in 1983. He was the only non-Black member of California's reparations task force. And I think it takes that kind of commitment to step forward, to be part of, to be perfectly honest, very difficult conversations. And we need more of that. And I've been very grateful to work with Don on my side, educating, and him being there every day during the hearings to talk, to hear from people, to make very difficult recommendations around reparations. So I wanted to lift up those examples. And the last thing I'll say is that coalition work is incredibly difficult, and it requires very intentional efforts and commitment for them to be successful.
Thank you, everyone. We can move on to the next panel question, which is, as you're doing this work, as you're talking to leaders and activists in different parts of the country, do you see any obstacles to meaningful change that might be unique to the Twin Cities or Minnesota? And what may be those obstacles?
You know, if I could frame it as more of a advantage than an obstacle, I think the obvious murder of George Floyd and spotlight of internationally puts a certain onus on Minneapolis and St. Paul, or maybe just Minnesota in general. And you know, I don't even think it needs to be framed as white guilt or complicity, but it's painfully obvious that if there's any kind of teeth in a racial reckoning, and whether it even commenced beyond a performative sense, it would behoove this state and this this metropolitan area to take the courage, find the courage, even if it's from outside forces, as in our Black community or communities of color, to make it a priority. So less an obstacle, but more of an advantage, I think. Although as time wears on, that advantage becomes less. So, I think it it takes a political mind and an assessment of the political climate to look for opportunities where that are advantageous for us to move this forward. And I'm not wired that way to survey a political field and look for that. But if it's top of mind for our communities, and by communities I mean the coalitions of all of us, folks of color and white allies, then it could be viewed as benign as the reparations that are occurring in Rondo as a form of, or the form of reparations in terms of zero interest loans for homeowners, or on a federal level, we can look at the weaponization of either 35W or 94 to address additional funding under the guise of however they want to frame it, similar to Pete Buttigieg and the Department of Transportation having additional funds for repair. So it's almost like the smuggling of this idea in such a polarized climate is one of the best ways. Obviously, it should be a multi-pronged, but the more benign and in the form of subsidy or refunds or zero interest loans, I think is part of the best way or best strategies to approach smuggling it, the ideas in, and then it can simply be written into policy or into law. Fingers crossed.
Ms. Tanaka, could you repeat the question, please?
Yes, of course. Yes. And I was actually going to maybe put you on the spot because the question is really about kind of local efforts. And do you see any obstacles to meaningful change happening that is unique to the Twin Cities or Minnesota?
I do. John hit the nail on the head at the end of his comment recently when he talked about the difficulty of building coalitions. But it is essential. And I think one of the things that I have seen that I piggyback on looking at the marriage amendment movement of the last 35 years and getting that bill passed, even though it is under a lot of duress currently, was that the people that I knew that were in the LGBT community, what they did, part of their plan was to go out to the areas that were the most difficult buy-in areas population-wise to their community. So that kind of meant the farmlands of Iowa, Wisconsin, Minnesota, the Dakotas, et cetera, et cetera. And they made it a point to interact with these people in their own backyards. for 3 decades consistently. And they would show up and they would get to know people without patronizing in one way or another, enough to really find out something that made sense to them and to the conglomerate that was most against same-sex relationships being formally acknowledged. And what they came up with, this is according to a gentleman who was one of the local leaders, is that both communities eventually agreed that you should be able to marry the person that you love. Now, I think that from a racial construct and a class construct, there has to be enough conversations where both the progressives for reparations and the progressives against reparations can talk enough to come up with something that both communities need for their existence in, say, 2 or 3 generations. In my world, it's about children. What kind of world do you want your children to grow up in? And how that dovetails into wealth disparities, housing, education, economic pros and cons. I don't have an answer for this afternoon, but I do believe that coalition and finding that sweet spot that all people can agree on that looks at reparations for what it truly can do to make Minnesota or the country a better place might be an interesting starting point. Just my opinion.
Kimmy, I would like to add that it's not necessarily specific to Minnesota itself, but probably specific across northern states. And that is the notion that all the stuff surrounding slavery happened down south, and that it was not a Minnesota issue. But it was a Minnesota issue because slavery came to Minnesota. It came to Minnesota at Fort Snelling. It came when the officers came and brought their slaves with them, and the slaves remained in that slave role as they were in Minnesota, where slavery was illegal. It is a Minnesota story because there was a Minnesota lawmaker who introduced a bill to make slavery legal in Minnesota during the summertime, when the Southern vacationers would come up and bring their slaves with them so that they could be in compliance with the law. So to me, it is Minnesota needing to understand its own history and its own history with regard to slavery and its impact. So that's, to me, something that needs to happen. We got to know, you have to know where you came from. You have to have a true reckoning of your history and who you are to then begin to even entertain the thought of, okay, what do we need to do about this? So those are the 2 examples I have.
I just wanted to, so I know I'm not local from your community, but I did just want to offer a couple of very quick comments. To Pam's point, it's a great point because the same conversations were taking place in California. You know, what is California doing, putting so many resources behind a statewide reparations task force? And the answer was addressed, I think, very swiftly, is that, like many states that were complicit in slavery, that were sanctuaries for folks who had these, who supported slavery at that time. So it really is a national issue as much as any. And then I wanted to just touch upon something that Ben talked about briefly, is that, so I'm very fortunate that my day job is running a nonprofit in San Francisco, California. And through that, I have worked with leaders in the Black community for decades. And I'm convinced that is the only reason why I was able to make this film. And people trusted me enough to share this story and to have enough confidence that I could tell it in a way that represented their views on it. So I do really want to emphasize the need for relationship building, and not just when there's a crisis, right? Not just when there's a movement, but that it's part of what is considered normal in our communities to come together, and to build community and to work on things together.
Thank you. I might go off script a little bit, so hopefully Steve won't get mad at me, but just because we are on the topic of teaching about this history and how important that is. And to Ben's point of for our future generations, and then to Pamela's point of part of us reconciling this history, the challenge is that we are not actually learning about it, the truth telling what is the history that we're trying to reconcile with. So as I think that all of the panelists are educators, in one form or another, and I am wondering if you want to speak to what are those ways that we are teaching folks about this history, and what the education piece for building coalitions, what are those strategies or what works well? Maybe I'll put James on the spot because you have been very working towards teaching folks about your family's personal history, and I don't know if you want to speak to that at all.
Sure. I mean, I would love to say I came up with the idea of the graphic novel or the comic that traces several narratives of Hastings activists, Black activist community, and being Black and activist was synonymous at that time. So I think there is opportunities. Again, I don't know why smuggling is the approach with me, but in a hyper polarized nation, you know, that's anti history, that's uncomfortable. If you can get comics and graphic novels such as John Lewis's March to tell the story in visual format, and a format that's comfortable both for you know, second graders as well as graduate students, or seniors for that matter. That's a viable format, and I'm thankful that, you know, I've with the help of a Vietnamese American here in Minneapolis, was able to create a comic, a first issue that touches on some of that unknown history or invisible or absent history from our texts. So I'm all for the graphic novel, the comic book strategy. The other strategy I can think of, even though I'm not a one who teaches history, I'm teaching the history of film. So I talk about cultural invisibility, and, you know, for example, a movie like Dog Day Afternoon that students may not realize was based on a real event, touches on Attica, touches on transgender, suddenly a film that they didn't think held much relevance to them. They can, it offers the opportunity to dovetail or to jump off and inform folks, or let them, if they're assigned with an essay, they can then do the work on some of these topics. So yeah, I mean, that's I wish, and I've got open minds at Augsburg. Not that minds aren't open at other colleges, but it tends to lean left, and so I think I'm preaching to the choir in a sense. But it's it would be really great if this could have a groundswell of attention, either through, I keep thinking of Roots in 77. It just sort of really suddenly put on the American landscape a family, characters that they could relate to, and slavery. Granted, it was based on a book and it was an adaptation and it was a series on TV, but that kind of use of media is and I'm partial to it, for me speaks of a way to, and same with 1619, of a way to start opening up dialogue for this uncomfortable history.
Thank you, James. I do want to make a note to say Steve has been busy putting in more information and links, including to your graphic novel, Hate Stings. And I'm going to also then ask Pamela if she has any more thoughts to add to this question, because you had been sort of the one to initially bring up learning about this history and why that's so important, and what that maybe how that takes shape in your life or in the work that you do.
So for us at the Minnesota Council of Churches, we have the task of creating programming to help people learn. So that's education in the sense of providing speakers from these communities to come and tell their stories, bring a captive audience to these events. But the other piece that we're exploring a little bit more into now is to work with organizations and alongside them, or collaborate with them in their efforts to do some storytelling. So I've had a conversation with Mr. Ben about his organization with youth interviewing elders from other communities. And so that's something that we're interested possibly in partnering and to get the information out. So it's just, for us, it's finding various means to bring the information to people based on different learning styles and attractiveness. So for instance, we co-sponsored an event with an organization that told the truth through a play that was written. And so there are people who learn better with plays and visible things, visual arts and whatnot. So we have that in the works. We have someone who has a group of youth who want to hear about the story of Mr. Smalls. And we had a Reverend Dr. Otis Moss III come to talk to adults, grown-ups about it, but someone there who worked with children said, listen, we need to have them come and tell this story, this truth to the children. So it's just finding different ways, whether it's through visual arts, whether it's through musical arts, whether it's through paint, whether it's through gallery visitations, whatever means to be able to get information to people so that they can do it. That's what we're interested in doing, and that's how we're trying to approach it.
And I'd love to hear also from Benjamin with your work with the African American Registry and also doing media, if you have anything to add too.
I do. One of the things that we do at the registry, beyond the street team programs, which Pamela spoke to, that may be a fit for the Council of Churches, is we work on supplementing existing curriculum and doing it in a manner that works with a trusted, factual-based database of content, which we have. What we've done is we've created a service called the Teachers Forum, and what it is it takes our culturally relevant content and puts it up against a pedagogy that we've created to work with 18 standard subject areas in K-12, and to do it by working with teacher candidates so that they can implement what they learn from our subscription service into the work plan before they graduate, before they get their license, and so they can take it into the classroom and work it through any of the basic subjects that are there to tell the factual story of the African American experience. Now, why does that make sense? Simply put, that if you look at the African American experience from the continent through Central South and North America, Canada, Mexico, Asia, and the like, you will see that in the last 600 plus years of the diaspora, our lives have intersected with every other color under the rainbow. Some through oppression, some through allies. But if the facts are there, all children in all classrooms will see themselves reflected, and they will see others reflected in areas that may not have to do with civil rights. It might have to do with medicine. It might have to do with law. It might have to do with education. But when they see themselves, they start to realize the parallels that they have with other people. And if that seed is planted consistently, I think that that will develop a tolerance, if you will, an open-mindedness, if you will, to where when they get old enough to make decisions like voting, if you will, they'll be in a position to do it more rationally and to help that wide intent be more inclusive going forward. I will share a link to the teachers forum on the chat.
Thank you. And I'm going to bring it back to Jon because I know that you have done work with sharing stories through the Japanese Youth Council and, choosing to work in film as sort of part of your work towards social justice and equity, and why film, and how has that helped sort of like helped the movement go forward? If you want to speak a bit more to using film as sort of like the avenue to share stories and to educate folks.
Sure, happy to. So I think what was really remarkable about the release of this film is that first of all, it was done in light speed, and it was done that way because we felt it was so critical to have a forum to be able to promote this type of conversation because it was right in the middle of the pandemic, right? We could not gather in person. It was very difficult to do anything as far as community gathering, screenings. And so we did a ton of these types of events just like this remotely. And we were able to bring in folks from different parts of the country. And so I think that was just such a great example of the power of film because you can share it from anywhere. And I think that we tried to put something together that was concise and digestible for folks to sit through and listen and learn. And it's been a very, I think, helpful conversation starter for something that people are often very uncomfortable talking about and frankly don't understand. And I just wanted to also share from the previous question that I think it's just important for this conversation for us to recognize that there are highly motivated, very aggressive, well-funded influences in this country that are trying to silence this part of our history. And that those of us who are part of today's event have to be just as aggressive and just as motivated, and to build a groundswell of folks who are willing to talk about this and willing to engage, whether or not they understand everything or agree with everything, is to really have an open and honest conversation about what's taken place in this country. And so just for the groups, so myself, Don Tamaki, and others, I mean, we have taken this film to churches, community centers, conventions, legal bar associations, all types of organizations with audiences big and small, to get as many people engaged in this conversation. And I would just promote, and I'm not trying to promote my film, but if it can be helpful, whether it's my film or some other material, I think the more conversation we can have about this topic, involve people, help them understand that it's what it's really about, I think the more helpful it is to combating some of the influences in this country that want to deny this history and squash this conversation.
Thank you, Jon. And thank you all. I think that is actually a really good place for us to invite the audience into the conversation. And I want to remind everybody there is a Q&A function. That's a button with the 2 speech bubbles. So feel free to enter questions you might have into that. And we do have one logistical question to start from Cassian, who says, is Jon's film available anywhere to watch again and to share with people?
So right now, it's all of my films are on a streaming platform called Canopy. Anybody with a library membership can access it. It's also available for educational distribution through a group called New Day Films. And folks are also welcome to contact me directly if they, if anyone's interested in organizing something similar to what we're doing today.
Thank you. I have they just wanted to follow up to say that the Hennepin County Library holders have access to Canopy, just as a note for everybody. I have another question, which is, how do we disrupt the tendency of marginalized groups to adopt the supremacist casting of other marginalized people and build solidarity? And I am happy to repeat that one. Disrupt the tendency of marginalized groups to adopt the supremacist casting of other marginalized people and build solidarity.
Help them heal. Help them heal. Help them realize that the pain that they're inflicting might not be something that they would tolerate if it was role reversal. Help them see themselves in the mirror to the point where they realize what they're doing from maybe a different point of consideration. That's what patience is involved in. It takes time. It is this work, this reparations work, in my view, is not something that can positively affect, in the name of results, anybody on this panel. This is for children that aren't even born yet. So our job is to set the table, and part of that table setting is to help those people that you talked about, Ms. Tanaka, heal. That's just my opinion.
I'm changing my battery, but I do have something to say. Hold on. Be open. Okay, so part of the notion of white supremacy and what it does is to divide others so that the status quo can be maintained. Ignore what that tendency is. Ignore the desire to stick within your own community, to talk only to your own people, but realize that our own people is everyone. We're all human beings. We all have something at stake for the betterment of the community. Step outside of your comfort zone and realize that sometimes the fear that we're inundated with regard to each community is created specifically to keep us separated and to not have conversations about things. Make a conscious decision that nobody's going to tell me what to do. Nobody's going to tell me how to do it with regard to what's best for my country, my society, and my folks. And your folks are everyone that you come in contact with. Okay, so I'm a preacher by nature. I guess I got to put the spiritual in it. Okay. Who is your neighbor? Whoever you're with, whoever you live among, whoever you interact with, that is your neighbor. And we are to treat our neighbors as we should treat ourselves. And if we love ourselves, then we ought to do the same for our neighbors. Ignore the status quo crap. Ignore the division. Ignore what you hear on TV. Those are just moments, just very small moments. And understand that we are all human beings with the same basic need, and that is to have happy lives, good lives. We want what's best for our families, and remember that's what's important, and not some of the crap we see on TV. And that's the best way I can put it. And I'm still working on this battery.
Yeah, and I didn't expect to follow a preacher. But you know, it takes courage. So if I could push back on the person who's asking the question, if you can look within yourself, it could start with you. And it could start with crossing borders, just as Pam mentioned. That takes courage. I don't know if it's my racial makeup that allowed me to traverse groups, but it's carried into my adulthood. But I don't think it's too late to perhaps dig deeper if you're introverted or lack the courage, questioning everything and digging deeper. Secondary sources is always beneficial.
I'll add one more thing. How do we do it? Why should we do it? And what has happened in this country is we have failed to see God in each and everybody's face. Each and every single last one of us was created in the image of God. And when we can look in one another's face and see God in their faces, then we realize that all that other stuff is just crap. So when you look at folks and you interact with folks, go looking for God, and I guarantee you'll find that common humanity in each and every one of us, which will help you have the courage to move forward to do this work.
Amen.
You're making it hard for anybody to follow that, Pam. And this was a question from Clarence, and I think, they wanted to add just that I think there's just so much stereotypes or images out there from media or the dominant media and culture that tells us how we should think about other communities of color, other people. And I think their question is kind of about like, how do we disrupt that? How do we fight against that? So I don't know if Jon or Benjamin have more to add.
Well, I'll just say that it's, and Pam already touched upon this, and I'll just add to it, is that, when we are not familiar with another group of people, we get prone to generalizing, right? Their behaviors and what they're about. And it's so important to meet people as individuals from other communities, from people that you're not familiar with, because then you get to understand them as people. And I think that we do have to be incredibly cautious about the narratives that get painted about different groups, because Pam is 100% correct. One of the tried and true white supremacist strategies in this country is to divide communities of color. That is what they want. And we have to be very intentional about disrupting that. And I do want to just say that in building coalition work across communities, that there are going to be missteps, and there are going to be disagreements, and there's going to be times when mistakes are made and it gets difficult to see a path forward. But that is why I go back to, if you have a foundation of a relationship, you can move past those disagreements, or you can understand them in a way where you understand that those, that not everybody is going to see things through the same lenses, but that there's still opportunities to work together. And so I bring it back to, the nonprofit I run in San Francisco was founded by young people who are part of the Third World Liberation Front here on the West Coast, who led student strikes to found ethnic studies across this country. And I bring that up because I think it's such an important example of the power of communities of color working together. And I think there's many examples of that, but I think it's hard, and it's hard to maintain. And so I just want to bring it back to, it really takes an intentionality and then a commitment to not only be part of an event like this, but to think strategically about, how do I create a space where we can continue this work together?
Thank you, Jon. I have a question that is maybe for our JACL members and our social justice committee. And it is, what ongoing work is happening in solidarity with the local Black community here in the Twin Cities and Minnesota beyond this event? And I'm not trying to put Vinny or Selena on the spot, but this could be a question for you.
All right. A good thing I kept my jacket on. I wasn't expecting to be on camera again. But yes, this is definitely the question, and one that we hope more people will start thinking about with this event, is we want to be doing more. Nationally, JCL works together with the NAACP and various other organizations and coalitions toward working on the passage of HR 40 and other congressional goals such as that. Within the grassroots community of JCL, there's a prominent kind of spin-off organization called Sudo for Solidarity. Our social justice our social justice committee within our chapter functions as the Minnesota chapter of Sudo for Solidarity. And one of Sudo for Solidarity's goals is to work toward Black reparations. So they regularly do national organizing and hold dialogues. So if anyone who is here in the audience today is also interested in joining these efforts and being a part of these conversations, we definitely want to be doing more at the chapter level. So this is the first of many events, we hope.
Did you say pseudo as in PSEUDO? Or how was how was that organization spelled, Vinny? Or
Yeah,
maybe
I can write it. Tsuru, it's the Japanese word for crane, usually referring to the origami crane. It,
great.
It is spelled TSURU for our ASL interpreter. Thank you, Vinny, for the best part of being a moderator is that I get to put people on the spot. So I have not had any new questions come up, but I want to just thank everybody for your time and for all of the work that you're doing to educate folks and to get people to have these conversations. And I'll open it up again to any last thoughts or comments.
Thank you so much for this opportunity. Had this event, or if had I not been contacted to participate in this event, this is something I knew nothing about. I had no idea about. And in this work and trying to figure out this reparation piece, which has been just fraught with so much confusion and trying to figure out where to begin and how to start. All of a sudden I see a little more clarity because of this, your organization and the work that you've done and this event and then the people that it's connected me to. So I just want to say thank you so very much. You've helped me tremendously in trying to figure out things, just make the path a little clearer as I'm trying to walk this road and try to figure out how to do this work in reparations. So thank you so much. And I look forward to being in contact with you all at some point in time to have more conversations and to strategize possibly on how to get this done. So thank you.
And I just wanted to express the same thanks to Steve and TCJACL for involving myself. And I also want to keep this conversation going and look forward to any additional connection we can have. And I hope I'm available and but I'm saying I'm willing and able and available to push this conversation forward and hope to keep this relationship alive.
I would echo the sentiments of the previous comments. I'm thrilled to not feel as lonely in regards to the task as I may have a month ago. And part of my agenda is to keep in touch with many of the people on this panel and to keep my finger on the pulse of the doings for the greater good through reparations.
I really want to thank you for allowing me to be part of this event. And this question didn't come up today, but I always have to make it a point to make this comment because it has come up in other conversations that I've been involved with, is that people have brought up to me, and I'll end it with this note, is people have brought up to me, well, what about all the wealthy Black people in this country, right, who have been so successful? And my response to them on that question or that comment has always been that despite all the entertainers and athletes and people we see in the media from the Black community who have been successful, to this day, at this moment in time, the racial wealth gap between white Americans and Black Americans continues to widen. And I think that's something that we all need to walk away from this event really absorbing, that notion that as much progress has been made, it's still the divide in wealth in this country is still getting wider. And I'll leave it at that.
Thank you, John. I do have one last question that came into our chat, which is, are there other local organizations here in the Twin Cities organizing around HR 40? For our audience today, if they want to get involved, if they want to continue to have these conversations, are there other organizations that we could tell them about? And a note from Steve is that he has been working so hard to include additional links and information in the chat, and we will post all of those resources and links to the film and everything once we get the video up. There is the St. Paul Reparations Task Force, and they do have a website on the government, the City of St. Paul website has information about that. Well, thank you all. I'm giving it a nice pause here to make sure I'm not missing any other questions. And then for Vinny or Steve, did you want to conclude with any other thoughts?
Hi, I'd just like to thank everyone for participating. It's been enlightening, and I agree with Ben. I hope that we can stay connected and continue this in the future. Ben, I want to talk to you sometime too. I have a question for you. We'll talk offline. Thanks again for everything.
Thank you, Steve. Thank you, everybody, for all of the work, energy that you put in. I think talking about having these conversations and working for these efforts is really taxing, and it's a lot of emotional labor, it's a lot of mental energy, but I think today's conversation, for instance, and other conversations that I've had, really for me, like breathes new life into this effort and coalition building. So I want to thank everybody for all of these years and time that you have put in to sharing history and to having conversations across communities. So thank you all, and have a great rest of your Sunday.
Thank you to everyone. Enjoyed time. Take care, all of you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Selena. Thanks, Vinny.
Thanks, Clarence. Thank you all.